We're live.
Woo! Jazz hands.
Okay, should I
No.
do the countdown for you?
Do the countdown.
Okay. In three, two, one.
This is Literary Roadhouse. One short story once a week. I'm Maya.
I'm Gerald.
And I'm Anais. And I can't wait to jump into this weird science fiction. Listeners with children should be warned that this conversation will definitely turn explicit, so share at your discretion.
Now for the summary. So make sure your kids are out of the room because there's no way to do the summary without it getting explicit. Because essentially we read Japanese hentai for this week, didn't we? So in this particular, poor Gerald, in this story, because I'm Maya, I'm not Anais with the well thought out summary. We have a young man who is living on another planet. There are these big aliens. I kind of envisioned them like giant centipedes, but then I kind of thought maybe they were giant like cockroaches with extra legs. Not sure. And there's this thing where the aliens use the humans to breed, and he is going to be coming of age to be bred. And the day that he is going to be used, he sees another young man who is in the throes of quote-unquote labor, and it horrifies him as they try to rescue this young man, and he runs out completely horrified, no longer wanting to be this creature's mate. And then he offers up his sister, saying, please, I don't want to do it. My sister wants you, so take her instead. And then his conscience gets the better of him, and he goes to the creature, and they make quote-unquote love, and now he is bred. That's essentially the story. Yes, we did read Japanese hentai for this week's podcast.
I, I, lo- I, lo- I loved you describing it as making love because
I thought the same thing, Gerald.
no, I've been doing it wrong all these years.
Yeah, this even start. We're already cracking up. Like, my face is flushed. Where do we even start? How did everybody like the story just on a basic level?
Yeah, I liked it.
How about you, Anais?
I liked it too. Like I said, I read it once before, 5 years ago, I think. So I kind of already knew what I was getting into, so I had less of like that shock value because I already did that 5 years ago. I remember the first time I read it, there was a couple lines where I felt like the bile rise in my throat, and this time I didn't want to vomit because, I guess I knew that was coming. But yeah, I still like it.
Yeah, I like the story. There were a couple moments where I felt like I was watching porn in my living room, and I'm like, are my kids watching me read the story? I felt a little guilty reading it in public. But I did like the story. We did, like you said in the pre-show when we were talking previously, we did have that one Ray Bradbury story that was science fiction. But this is science fiction. This is like real science fiction. We've got aliens. We've got alternate realities. It's a short story, and there's a lot of world building in a very, very short amount of words. And I was very impressed with her skill because I haven't read a lot of science fiction. I just haven't. And I now fully understand why she is elevated, why Octavia Butler is elevated with such high standing in the science fiction community, because I would say that this is hard science fiction. Well, I don't know what the definition between science fiction and hard science fiction is, but this is science fiction, but there were a lot of literary elements used to create a world that felt very real, and nothing felt contrived, and it felt very natural on the page to me. And so that was the stuff that I enjoyed most about it. How about you guys?
Yeah, it was. I also saw it described as dystopian, which sort of fits. It's a funny old world and topsy turvy, and at first I like to read a story and get into the story, but the names trip me up all the time. They just I don't know. I just like to read them Yeah, it's so, but you know, apart from that, yeah, it was fascinating, a fascinating story.
Um, just now when you were mentioning the world building, I also liked what she did with time, where even though it's aliens and it's, technology wise, I don't even know where it would be in terms of like the human story, but it doesn't feel like it's in the future. It feels very present day, which makes sense because it's dealing with very present day themes and a few sort of like eternal themes that will never kind of go out of fashion. So, I thought that was really crafty. Like it felt like, oh, this is happening right now. I'm a contemporary to this story. And the fact that I believe that, I thought was really effective.
Hmm.
Yeah, as you're saying that, it brings to mind something that I read a while ago, maybe a couple years ago, where they were talking about futurism, people that project what's going to happen in the future professionally for businesses and movies and stuff. And one of the things that they were saying is the hallmark of really, really good futurism is that it does feel more current, because if you look at our society 200 years ago compared to now, yeah, it's really, really different, but there are certain things that are always the same. People don't talk that much differently. People's clothing changes, but it doesn't change that dramatically. And so in good science fiction, you're going to have elements that are very current because people just don't dramatically change. Even 1,000 years ahead, we're still going to be human. And that was something I thought was done really well. I liked the fact that I went into this story not knowing anything, and the world building was doled out a little bit at a time. There was no like first paragraph explanation. There was no like big long like this is what happened to this world. There was a quick sentence like what 2/3 of the way into the story that explained about the people coming and the fight between the aliens and the people and their relationship. But it was really, really short, and it was like 2/3 of the way. So I'd already bought into the world by the time I got there, which was something I really thought was well done, and something that sometimes in literary fiction I think we forget to do that. I think that's something that I would like to take from science fiction and remember that as I'm writing literary fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
About language.
Yeah, well, just real quick, yeah, that's kind of like a science fiction rule, right? Like, you don't info dump in the beginning. And if you like, if you ever seen, like, when people write science fiction stories for other people to critique, there's always someone there being like, oh, this is a whole paragraph of world building, right? You're supposed to weave it through. But one thing I was going to say when you mentioned futurism that I was thinking of was, you're right that with the futurism, you still want timeless themes, but there's like a lesson in futurism that's like, if humanity doesn't watch out for this could be the consequence of this behavior, where this story didn't have that. It's not, it's not kind of like a look at the path you're on. It's completely,
yeah, 2/3 of the way in, we realize that they're not even on Earth anymore, that these people came to this planet for some reason, that they were being subjugated or there was wars or something. They had to escape whatever planet they were on previously. But we didn't even get that right away. Like, I wasn't sure if it was Earth, like where these aliens come from, but the language had bought me in so much. I didn't care that I didn't know, and so I just kept reading. How about you, Gerald? I know you had problems with names, and I have a hard time with that too. A lot of times with science fiction names, even fantasy names, it like makes me almost subconsciously hiccup whenever I get to someone's name, and it slows down my reading experience. And there's this thing about the apostrophes in the middle of people's names. Like, what's up with that?
Yeah, I know, and it's and for some reason, I know some people it doesn't bother at all, and they just they look at the name once and they work out how to pronounce it in their head, and then they move on. But every time I come to one of the names, it goes and I stop. But I thought it was really interesting because the humans in the story were very human, and the relationships between the humans and even between the humans and the whatever they're called, Tigatoi, that was very stop it. That was recognizable as human and current. Yeah, it's so
exactly what you're talking about. Like, it was a relationship that we could recognize as a relationship, and so it didn't seem foreign.
Yeah, it was a kind of a weird relationship, and and we'll probably move on to that. But it was still recognisable as two creatures, or one set of creatures, a different set of creatures having a relationship together. So that's so yeah, it was certainly accessible as science fiction.
I was gonna say, and the relationship between the Tliks, that's the like centipede aliens, and the Terrans, it kept making me think of, because the aliens were very human, and one of the ways in which they were very human is sort of that exploitation of like an inferior animal, right? Because that's how they see the Terrans. It has to be that exploitation. But there's this interesting sort of like political side of it where the Tliks are trying to deal with like the ethical side of it, where they're like, but we put them in a preserve, which is like this big land, so the humans have a great life before we totally exploit their bodies. And we're trying to like have rules that there aren't unnecessary abuses. And it made me think of like how we mitigate the ethics of animals that we use exploitatively. So I really like that parallel as well, because it made the aliens someone you can identify with. They weren't barbarians, despite the fact they're doing this to what would be our race. And the fact that she could convince you of that, it was just like, oh, you're so good.
Yeah.
It did two things. It made it easy to identify with them because they were so human, but also it added a moral element to the story.
Yeah, you say preserve, I say prison. It's
I'm sure the lawyer would say that as well.
The characters would agree with you, because the older brother, Kui, remember when he tried to run away from home and he's like, I'm just running in a cage? Because the words cage, pin, I don't know if they use the word prison, but they might as well have, right? Like, that aspect of it is never absent from the story. Even when they're cuddling, the aliens and the humans, the claws are like a cage around them.
Yeah. And I think it's also good that she describes the Tliks as or Tagatoi, this particular one, as standing between this particular family and the others, protecting them and keeping them safe and all this sort of stuff. And you think, yeah, but you're still exploiting them.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but imagine if they'd been left to their own devices and the angry hordes of horny cliques raped and ravaged and pillaged like humans have been known to do. Which is essentially what happened previous to the preserve. Like, isn't that why they made the preserve? Was because it had gotten so out of hand that the humans were killing the cliques and the cliques were raping and pillaging, and so they created a preserve and they hooked up and tried to make it more familial. So instead of just using dogs as beasts of burden, they became pets. Their relationships with humans was very similar to our relationships with our pets, in as far as exploiting but at the same time loving and having a familiar relationship, but an inherently unequal one. And I think it was done in such a way that I didn't bristle. Sometimes stories like this, where they have like a really strong moral component, it just comes on too heavy-handed, and you're just like, come on now, I just want to read a story. The moral component, I was so into the story that the moral implications of the story didn't come to me until after I'd finished the story. Like, that's when it hit me, the experience that I just had. I wasn't having that moral questioning as I was reading the story, which made it so that I got through it much more involved.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it was a good story in and of itself. It was an interesting story. It was fascinating, and only afterwards, and I sort of did some research between the two readings. So when you go back and read it a second time after sort of understanding a little bit more about her and about how she writes and what she writes, then it becomes a much more interesting story, and you can see the themes more clearly.
Yeah, and there were a lot of really important themes, which was an excellent segue, which I just ruined by pointing out that it was an excellent segue. What themes did you guys see in the story?
I was going to let Gerald go first.
Why?
I don't know.
He's still traumatized by being bred in the story and stuff.
I think the themes are a little thorny to unpack. Actually, I forgot I had a joke set up and then I forgot the joke. When you were like, "What did you guys feel about this story?" I'm like, "Well, it's a heck of a coming of age story." Like, haha. Like,
So long, grown.
but but yeah, like so there's that like kind of coming of age aspect of it, which it's kind of like weird, like because it starts with the very first line is the last day of my childhood. There's this point where it's like now. Although I wonder, is what made him an adult? Was it the implantation? Was it seeing the birth, the dissection? A little bit of both.
For me, it was seeing the reality rather than seeing his childhood illusion. Like, to me, that is the definition of becoming an adult, and that's what I saw in it. Although, I mean, I guess you could say, depending on the society, it definitely could be the implantation. I think a lot of teenagers nowadays consider sex to be the major coming of age moment of their lives. But for me, it came before that. How about for you, Gerald? When do you think?
Yeah, and I think also because he saw the quotes birth of the other guy, Lomas, which didn't go well and was difficult, because he saw that, but then still agreed to the implantation or to the making love, as I would call it. then but I think that sort of shows, because he was aware of what it means then, and the risks and the dangers, and so, but he still agreed to go ahead with it. So that, I think, that's, for me, that's where he came of age. He took a sort of more adult view of
I think
the
you can
thing.
go either way with that, because I think traditionally the idea of men becoming men when they start to put their families ahead of themselves is kind of almost, it's pretty universal.
Yeah, though one of the interesting things about that quote unquote decision, that consent, is it's like, is it really? I'm like, it's kind of yes and no, because the part of me that wants to say no is part of why he gives in is because he wants to protect his sister so she doesn't go through it, and the only way he can protect her is by submitting, because the power is so unequal between them. So when one person has that much power that you're basically forced into this kind of like, between this very difficult choice, it's like, is that really consent? But then there was that other element that was kind of creepy and weird to the decision, where it was he was also jealous of the idea that his sister would be the one to have that kind of like intimate moment with Tigatoy, the alien, because he actually loves her. So it's like, that's really weird. Yeah.
From like the get-go, he's been raised with this expectation that would be hard to let go. I can definitely see that.
Mm-hmm.
Any other themes?
Me again?
I saw it definitely, like we already spoke about, there was the theme of how we treat lower animals and how lower animals treat us. I thought that was really, really important, and it was thought-provoking.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that kind of stayed with me. I think that's the theme that actually stayed with me after the fact. The coming of age theme was an interesting story, and I loved it, but I felt like that was the one that really stuck with me, because essentially humans have done something to where they came from, and now they're in this new place, and they're being treated the way they've probably treated lower animals themselves, and I thought that was really interesting. The interdependence of species. Fascinating and really well done. Really, really.
Yeah, that's that theme of like symbiosis. The thing is, so it's clear why the aliens need the humans. But the only reason the humans need the aliens is because they've been subjugated by them. It's kind of like nowadays, like domesticated dogs need us because we domesticated them. So if we're not there, then they won't survive. So it's kind of like chicken and egg.
Know if that's so much the case. I mean, they came to this planet for a reason. They came and it was already occupied. Would they have known how to survive on this planet if the aliens hadn't been there? Like that's the question to me. I think there is a symbiotic relationship there, partially because the humans came and they were in really small numbers, and there were a large amount of aliens. They came there for a reason, and the symbiotic relationship allows them to live on this planet where they're completely outnumbered.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the however you pronounce it, the main alien character, um, is shows some sign of conflict, internal conflict between the subjugation of the humans and the use of the humans and the keeping of them, safe by locking them up and wrapping their arms around them and all this sort of stuff. But there is some attempt to understand the humans, I think, from her perspective, and also understand what the humans are thinking.
Hmm. You know what it kind of reminded me of when you said that?
Oh.
There, there, during slavery, right before the abolition of slavery, there were multiple plantations where the owners had inherited the plantations, but the owners were very conflicted. They were like one generation removed from abolitionists themselves.
Mm.
And it kind of reminded me of that, where you're an abolitionist, but you own these creatures, and you have put yourself in this paternal situation where you think them lesser than you, so you want to take care of them, but in taking care of them, you're subjugating them. It kind of reminded me of that, that gray area between the strict Southernists and the strict abolitionists, that those people that were in the middle, that were conflicted. It definitely reminded me of that. And I felt like a lot of the politics of the story kind of reminded me of slavery, and in a way that was really important. I also found it really interesting, poor Gerald, I found it wonderful and interesting that it explored the emotional dynamics of men being the ones that are being bred. The whole idea of, well, they prefer women, but they do it to men because they need the women to produce more humans.
Hmm.
But then when the creature says, well, it would be easier on her because she's already expecting to carry life within her, I found that a fascinating line. I love that line, and it really kind of tickled the back of my head, because I get that. Like, I can see that it would be much more difficult for a man to be in that situation than a woman, because he's not expecting, he's biologically, socially, culturally not expected to carry life. But in this situation, he is expected culturally. He has been raised with this expectation, but it's still easier on the woman because she's biologically more prepared for that. I found that very, very fascinating.
Yeah, I think I honestly don't know how. I don't know. It's a strange statement. I don't know.
Alien came down from the sky and wanted to breed with you, Gerald.
I know. I don't know how I'd have to buy me dinner first.
It's funny, Maya,
I'm not
hearing you
Indian.
talk about that expectation just made me realize that scene where Tigatoy is taking the little larva out of Bram or Lomas. She's reacting the way that, like, so like if you had a couple um, like a husband and wife like watching someone else's birth, she's reacting the way that you might expect the guy to react, and Gan is reacting the way you expect a woman to react. So Gan's only seeing the suffering of Lomas, the pain, oh my god, the squick, you're being torn open, the blood, and then there's Tigatoy going like, it's a male, like just like
Hey, cigars.
hey.
Yeah, it's kind of strange. Yeah.
Love that as well. It is. I kind of got a kick out of that. The story was very pleasant in that respect.
It's quite interesting. I did read somewhere that she's adamant it's not about slavery, which is sort of kind of strange, and because it seems to be so applicable to slavery. The slavery themes and keeping people and looking after them because it's actually in your own interest and that sort of thing. But she did say no, it's not about slavery. So whether she's just being
When I think, as a person who writes and as a person of color,
mm,
I think there are a lot of themes that we put in our stories that we are not consciously aware of when we put them in there. When you
Yeah.
write, whatever's going on in your subconscious is going to come out, And there have been times when I've written something and someone later said, "Oh, this is what you wrote." I'm like, "Oh my God, that totally is what I wrote. How did I not see that?" And as a Black woman, right now, the issues of race and the repercussions of slavery and my relationship with society is very much in the forefront of my mind. Whenever you get a whole bunch of Black people together, race comes up, usually within like the first half an hour of conversation.
Really?
Something crazy and they got to unpack it. And so the idea that as a Black woman, anything I write is not going to have some sort of applicability to race or identity is kind of just ludicrous. I know it's going to be there, just like my stupid water themes that show up everywhere. I try to write a story without water, and it still appears because it's in my subconscious.
It's funny because I had that exact same thought, like everything you just said, but then as I kept doing my research, it's like Octavia Butler came out to school both of us and everybody who thinks that way, because in this interview with Science Fiction Studies, she said, what a reader brings to the work is as important as what I put into it, so I don't get upset when I am misinterpreted, except when I say that what I really meant was so-and-so, and I'm told, oh, but subconsciously you must have meant this. I mean, leave me alone. I don't mind attempts to interpret my fiction, but I'm not willing to have critics interpret my subconscious. I doubt they are qualified. I was like, oh, she just schooled me.
Yeah,
a lot of stuff is going to come out in your subconscious, but I'm not going to argue with an author. If someone says something, I'm going to be like, okay.
yeah.
Whatever you say, that's what you wrote. I'm seeing what I'm seeing. It's all good.
She's fascinating. You know, doing the research between the two readings. She's a fascinating woman, really, really interesting, and you know, her whole history, and she was an only child, although there'd been 4 children that before her that had died, and it's you know, and her whole upbringing and how she there's this one bit of video that I saw where she said, you know, she watched this sci-fi film and she thought, I can write a story better than that, so she did. I thought that's just brilliant.
You know, I think she's a very fascinating science fiction voice. Honestly, I think if I had read one of her stories as a young kid, I probably would have enjoyed science fiction and kept reading science fiction. I think she would have been a much better introduction to science fiction for me, because when I read science fiction, you know, typical white male author science fiction, I didn't identify with it. I didn't find it fascinating. It didn't attract me. The first science fiction story I read that really drug me in was Wraith the Through, and that was written by Storm Constantine, who was a woman again. And I feel like this definitely like brings on the importance of having a lot of diversity in science fiction, because as a young girl, being faced with traditional science fiction, it turned me off. But you know, here's these people that are writing these amazing stories that I never read.
Going back to sort of like her commentary and stuff, so she says it's not about slavery, it's about symbiosis and also male pregnancy. Okay, so she says it's about, and obviously that's there.
No offense, no pun intended.
Yeah, but I was hoping you guys could help me out with, like, okay, so you have this theme you're exploring of male pregnancy, and the takeaway is...
It's bloody gruesome and they can't handle it. So, how do you feel about male pregnancy after reading this story? I'm actually kind of curious, like, what your thoughts were as you were reading.
I mean, with my sort of equality hat on, I sort of think, yeah, why not? You know, of course it's.
Take off the equality hat. What was your gut saying?
Oh, shit. How can any woman go through this? It's appalling. Why do you do it? I just can't understand it. And that's where the sort of biology, psychology, physiology thing about being better prepared to have children. I think because men would never would you know, learn about the process of having a child and then think, nah, I ain't going to do that. So and yet with women, there's something sort of overriding that says, yeah, I'm prepared to do that in order to bring a child into the world. So I think that's where men and women differ.
Mhm.
I have slightly different thoughts on that, Anais.
No, you should go. Teach me the way. I'm like,
I'm just thinking of all the women I know, like
mm,
statistically, the majority of children are not actually planned. They're like, okay, if it happens, it happens, or they're accidents.
mhm.
Because if you sit down and plan that mess, it's not that exciting either.
Well,
Especially by the time you're considering it's too late, and you're like, okay, the train's left the building.
well, the male pregnancy aspect.
Not to have kids, and they've remained child-free throughout their lives because it is so horrifying.
Well, right. And so I was gonna say, it's like the male pregnancy aspect is a big part of the science fiction. But to me, you could have kept a female pregnancy, and the science fiction's all there. Because to me, just the way that we have kids naturally as humans is like, that's insane. That like it's crazy. Like evolution was like, let's do it this way. Let's just like massively just cut it out. And it's horrible.
Actually existed, and God was on crack. He designed that mess because none of it makes any sense. Why couldn't we just have eggs spawn?
That's what I always say. I'd much rather lay an egg. We are of a mind here.
Yeah, but you do that, and it's less fun, isn't it? Let's face it.
No, Gerald.
Some crap.
Laying an egg's way more fun.
I'm being very
If you look at it, like, you step back, take off the music, put on the bright lights, God, this was
very selfish here. You're talking like some sort of fish thing, aren't you? Here, that's just,
I like the idea of spawning like fish.
You can swim.
That's so funny. This podcast going nowhere good real quick, and this goes downhill from there. But, I mean, there's the whole joke about pregnancy amnesia, where usually by the time 2 years comes on, you've kind of forgotten just how painful it was. Like, there's a reason for that. You wouldn't have a second one if you remembered. I think there's a lot of biology in play that kind of tampers it. I feel like the female orgasm is like it's okay, honey, here's your present for all the hard work. That's why ours are better.
I'm not going there.
Gerald's like, no, let's get back to the story.
There was a story?
Periods.
Oh, okay.
I guess it was going to go nowhere. But, it's interesting how biology kind of, like, gives you incentive to keep the population going, even if the whole process is gruesome and horrifying. Like, the incentive for him to want to be bred is that he cares about this creature and he wants to protect his family, and there's that symbiotic relationship. If there wasn't that, he would be like, hell no.
And he's trying to be on equal footing with her, even though he really can't. But there's that one wonderful line where they're kind of fighting over the gun. He's not supposed to have a gun. No one can have one on the preserve. And even though they have more, and if he gave that one up, she wouldn't know where the other ones are. It's not about the gun. It's about being able to make decisions for yourself and have trust. And he says that line where he says to her being the insect alien, there is risk, Gatoy, in dealing with a partner. Which is why it isn't a partnership, which is why you're on a preserve. And I think at the end of it, he feels like he made a decision and he's gained some agency or is on equal footing with her, but I think he's only fooling himself. I don't think that's the case.
No.
I think on some level she cares about him too, though, and caring about someone does give them a certain level of power, even if the relationship is inherently unequal. Him turning away, she would have had to turn to his sister because she needed to get rid of that egg, but it would have hurt her. It definitely would have emotionally hurt her. And I think we saw that in the story. And the difference between social power and emotional power is something that is important. It's something that is often not distinguished. And in this story, I do feel like they're extremely unequal as far as their place in society and the subjugation that's natural in their relationship. But on an emotional level, they're slightly like they're still unequal, but they're not as unequal. Like that gap has been closed a little bit because there are emotions that are going both ways. Mm-hmm. So wow, what a messed up life. I'm so glad I don't live on that planet. Can we just take care of this so I don't have to go there and be bred?
And do you think there's any with the sort of male female switch that was going on? Do you think there's any sort of representation of the subjugation of females by or women by men here on Earth? Because I that sort of occurred to me at one point where she had the power and she was being all protective of him. And saying don't worry about it, it's fine, and all this, I'll keep you safe, and all that sort of stuff. But by the way, here's my here's my baby, sort of thing. And I thought then that maybe she's exploring this sort of topsy-turvy relationship, and
I think so. How does that make you feel? Like it kind of is a little icky feeling to see it because it's science fiction, it's easier to explore that relationship in a way that makes you uncomfortable. You can explore it deeper than you can necessarily if they were humans, where it gets a little squicky because then you look at your wife and you're like, am I like that? But in aliens, it's a little easier to be like, aliens are bad people.
No, we're not like that at all.
I think there's some truth to what Gerald is saying, a little bit, just in the sense that, like, even though Tigatoy cares about Gan, in this kind of like weird like nurturing human pet relationship where the alien's the human, like she does care about him, and when he's refusing, but it isn't like she's like, oh, you don't want me to, we need to figure out our relationship, we're on equal footing here. It's, well, if you won't have my baby, someone else will, right? So there might be some commentary about that dynamic between men and women amongst humans as well. And Octavia Butler always said that she writes for an audience made up of three kinds of people. She said she writes for black people, for feminists, and for science fiction lovers. So the feminist component is pretty strong within her writing, her thinking, and her essaying.
Yeah, I definitely see what Gerald is talking about. Like, to not see it would border on blindness, just to me. When I look at their relationship, that inherent unequalness doesn't feel like it's exploitive, but to me it's a type of exploitive that I've seen and I'm familiar with, so it's not entirely uncomfortable. Like, to me, like, it very much was, it kind of reminded me, of a young bride. Like, they've been someone, in a culture where you're going to marry this person from birth and you're raised for that position, and then the wedding night happens. I think the thing that made it very different was the idea that the egg had to come out. And so rather than having time to sit down and talk their relationship over and unpack it, it was going to go somewhere. But at the same time, that creature cared about him enough to not just pin him down and force the issue. And I think in human relationships, that is a distinctive, like, difference. It's the difference between waiting and having so much disrespect that you're just going to pin him down and force it. And in this case, there was respect going both ways, because he was willing to say, okay, if this isn't what you want, then that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do wonder though whether she was actually far more cognitive of his feelings than he gave her credit for, because she knew that by saying, well, if you're not going to take my egg, then I'll give it to your sister. Mm-hmm. Maybe she knew that that's not what he would want, and that would put him in a difficult position. Or maybe I'm giving this creature far more.
Before he actually said something that his sister would actually want to be in that position. His prize that his sister would have been happy to have been the one to be bred. And so he's thinking, I don't want to do this, but my sister would be happy doing this. And I don't know if the creature brought that up in order to do a little reverse psychology, or if the creature brought that up because in that family's dynamic, that would be the logical conclusion.
Mm.
And she is manipulating him, and he knows that because there's that line. I mean, she is playing him because she knows what buttons to push, and he's aware that she's doing that because at one point, he's saying no one ever asks us if we want to be hosts to these eggs, and then he says to her, "Ask Bugatoy," and then she says, "For my children's lives," and then he thinks she would say something like that. She knew how to manipulate people, Taryn and Tlick. Like, he knows that she's sly as hell with that sort of thing.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of exploration of male and female relationships in the story that I think is really interesting, and I look forward to rereading this. How did you feel, Anais, reading it a second time with so much distance between the first read and the second read?
So I was really surprised about stuff that I'd forgotten. So I didn't really remember the relationship between all his family members and the aliens, and those relationships are really important because if you only see his relationship with Tigatoy, then all of a sudden you start wondering, like, but does he really love her, or is he a drug addict because, he's having all of the sterilized eggs, which is like a drug to humans. But then you see how there's other people who are exposed to the eggs. The older brother has the eggs, and he still hates the aliens, and he still doesn't want to give in. The sister has a completely different kind of take on it. She thinks it's an honor to have the eggs, whereas the main character doesn't, but he's attached. Then the mother is able to refuse the drug most of the time because she doesn't want to owe the aliens anything. She doesn't want to owe them her children. So I think seeing all the different ways that these relationships can form, even when you're exposed to the same environment, the preserve, and the same drug, gives strength to the relationship between Gan and Tigatoy. It makes it seem more legit. Like, that could have gone a different way. Here are other examples.
Yeah, I think you nailed something really important there. It's a well-crafted story. Like, when you talk about it just on a craft level, I think that's what elevates the story above its genre. Like, you can have a literary story of any genre, and I think that that's part of what elevates this story is the level of craft and the fact that the story is so timeless. It was written when, and it's still very relevant. It still feels very contemporary. It's still a heavily read story. And I think that's part of what elevates it is the level of craft involved and the universality of the themes involved. It makes it so that in 50 years we can still read the story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was written in '85, so it's 30 years old.
Yeah. In 20 more years, I'm still going to be able to go back and read this story and get just as much out of it. And I can tell that right away. There's that thing where they say a lot of times you don't know what's going to be classic until well after the fact. But I think this is a case where you can read the story and you can say, in 100 years, this story is probably going to be brought out in some high school class, and they're going to look at it and read it and talk about science fiction in, the 1980s or whatever, and it's going to be one of those types of stories. Like, it definitely strikes me as a classic short story, even though it is what is very much a science fiction story, and a lot of literary authors, a lot of literary critics would say science fiction isn't literary fiction. But in this case, it definitely is. This is definitely, I would consider it literary fiction. It's just that universal to me.
It's quite interesting. Listeners should have a little search around, and there's on one of the websites there was a piece of video where she was on a panel, and what they've done is they've cut her bits, so it's about 4 minutes long with things that she says, but her discussion of science fiction writing is really interesting, and where she saw it going and how she thinks it fits in with life. It's well worth a watch just to hear what she thinks.
Yeah.
Maybe we can link to it in the show notes.
Maybe we can. Yeah. We can do that.
Send it over. That would be wonderful for our listeners to be able to look at. I know, like, she's a really popular author in the science fiction circles, and I know in the minority community, her name is very well known. But she isn't a writer that I had read anything of growing up where I grew up. She just wasn't as well known. And I feel like for our listeners who aren't aware of who Octavia Butler is, having those resources in the show notes will be really interesting for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any last words on this story? Anything that we didn't like? Because this has just been a love fest.
Yeah, I can't necessarily point to anything that I didn't like. I enjoyed it throughout.
Yeah.
But at the same time, even though I love the story and it's solidly crafted and I think it's worth a reread over and over, I still wouldn't say it's like a blow away right home about a kind of story. I think because I've read her anthology and there's this one other story that's in that anthology called The Evening, the Morning, and the Night, which for me is just like out of the park good. Um, yeah, so but she's, this is still, it's kind of, I don't want to say it's what put her on the map, but it's definitely the short story from her that's gotten the most attention.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
She won a Hugo and a Nebula with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, this story won some pretty major awards.
Mm-hmm.
That's like the Oscars for science fiction. So, yeah, the fact that you say that her other story is actually better kind of says a lot.
Yeah.
Mm.
Her abilities and who she is as a writer. So I have been the same way. I can't think of anything offhand that I don't like about it. I think that's because it's just so tightly crafted. It is just that tight. Like, there's nothing that stood out as being a problem. There's nothing that stood out that I thought could have been done better. It was just a great story for the story that was being told.
I will say, if I was nitpicking and like wanted to be like, well, this wasn't 100% perfect, her writing isn't necessarily anything special. It's really effective, and the words are very well chosen. But she isn't like some great lyricist, or it's not like she goes into a description of something and puts in these amazing metaphors or imagery.
She's not a lyrical writer.
No.
I mean, what would you classify it as? Like, when you read some of the realist writers, like, it's just like, this is the way it is, this is what happened, these are normal words that normal people would use. I'm not bringing out a Latin dictionary to write this. Like, she's that type of writer. And what's interesting is the science fiction writers that I read that turned me off of science fiction were lyrical science fiction writers. Same thing with some fantasy. Like, oh man, I'm going to get hate mail. I've never been able to read through The Hobbit. I get 25, 30% of the way through. I'm like, okay, I'm done. I just can't get to sit in a chair long enough to get through that mess. And I felt like there was a lot of science fiction that I was reading, in high school and my early 20s that was like that. That was just so lyrical that it was like, I already have to deal with your funky names. Can you use English here? She writes in a really simple way that makes it so that the complex themes and the complex names are easier to swallow. Not everything is complex. And so I like that about her, but you're right. She's not that type of writer.
And I was actually just thinking of a moment where I was reading and I thought like, in the hands of a more lyrical writer, the sentence would be completely different. And it's when she's describing when the larvae are moving beneath Bram Lomas's like body on the skin, and it says there was a movement on the right side, tiny, seemingly random pulsations moving his brown flesh, creating a concavity here, a convexity there, over and over until I could see the rhythm of it and where the next pulse would be. It's just so straightforward. It's almost clinical.
Yeah. My question to you, Anais, is if it had been more lyrical and less clinical, would it have been as gruesome and as satisfying?
I don't know. I think you'd have to put it in the hands of somebody who can write gruesome really well, like a Chuck Palahniuk or something. He could probably,
To me, part of what makes it so gruesome is just how clinical it is described. Like, that is gruesome to me. Like, if it had been described all, like, lyrically and beautifully, I would have been reading this wonderful lyrical language instead of seeing this really gruesome thing in front of me. It's part of what made it so effective for me. That's interesting. How about you, Gerald?
Yeah, I was trying to think when you said, is there anything you didn't like? And I was desperate to. I couldn't put my finger on what I don't like, and it's not that I don't like it, but I very much agree with Anais that it's just a bit sort of, the writing is just a bit so-so. Not and it's sort of, it doesn't have the sparsity of the great Hemingway or people like that. And it doesn't have any sort of flowing lyricism in it either. So it's sort of just sort of in between. So I think, well, it's a great story, and I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the writing. That's what sort of stops it getting to that top level.
That would keep it from getting to that level for you. Whereas
Yeah.
for me, I'm on the opposite side. I'm of the thought that if it was more lyrical or more sparse, it wouldn't have been as gruesome and as effective for me. I felt like the fact that it used everyday language and it sounded so clinical in some parts and so just normal and realistic is part of what made it effective for me. That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about anything that I didn't like about the story, like you guys, I'm really struggling to find something. Yeah, at first I thought maybe it could have been longer, but no, because there was nothing in that story that I felt like needed to be longer, needed to be more explained. It was just well done to me. But at the same time, I won't say it's a 6. Like, when I read this story, I enjoyed it, and to me, it was a perfect story for the story that was being told. But it wasn't open the skies, angels sing. It was, wow, this is an amazing writer. I want to read a lot more of her. No wonder people have been talking about her. This is really interesting type of feeling. So, are we ready to rate? Is that what I'm hearing?
I think so.
I'm going to give it a 5.5. How about you guys?
It's a 5 for me.
5 for you?
Yep, a 5 for me as well. I wonder if I had read it for the first time and never read it before, if it would have been a 5.5 just for the shock value. But I guess having that already been taken care of a few years ago, is that fair? I don't know. I always rate how I feel in the moment, so it's a 5.
And how did last week's story do?
So listeners haven't weighed in yet on The Half-Skin Steer by Annie Prue, but I think it's because everyone's listening from the beach. It's summer. They're too busy soaking up the sun to drop us a line. I
You don't
guess.
think it's horrified about a half-skinned deer?
Or they're just too scared and just horrified. No, I don't think they're horrified. We have some hardy listeners.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, that was an interesting discussion last week. I really enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
So this week we are going to have a short quiz. I actually think these are pretty easy. I took this quiz and got most of the questions right, which never actually happens. It's a science fiction quiz. So, what stories are you guys submitting this week?
I'm submitting Wagons Ho by Paget Powell. I don't know anything about it. So here we go.
Okay, that's a shot in the dark. And I'm submitting The School by Donald Bartlemy.
Okay. So, who's going to go first? Let's do ladies first, because, this story was all feminist and everything.
Yeah.
How I choose who goes first.
Yeah.
So, if Anais does not get this question right, then Gerald has an opportunity to steal it, because I think these questions are so easy, we're going to need all the points we can get. So here we go. First question. One of the first science fiction films to be taken seriously by critics and moviegoers alike. This 1968 movie was made by Stanley Kubrick. Which film is it? Fantastic Voyage, Plan 9 from Outer Space, Metropolis, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Anais?
I don't know. Fantastic Voyage. Was it Space Odyssey? No, Fantastic Voyage? I don't know.
I'm just horrified right now. I'm so horrified.
Is it Odyssey's that old? No.
It's Gerald, what movie is it?
2001: Space Odyssey.
It's a freaking classic!
I know it's a classic, but I didn't think it was that old. For some reason, I thought it was like 70s. I thought it was the 70s. So I was like, should it be something else?
I'm like, what? I think this was one of those what's a tape deck moments. Gerald?
Yes.
Your question is? In space, no one can hear you scream. This was the famous tagline for which 1979 space thriller starring Sigourney Weaver? The Terminator, The Blob, Swamp Thing, or Alien?
Alien.
Woohoo! Anais,
Mm-hmm.
are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, let's do this. We gotta make up some points here. Which 1979 movie about post-apocalyptic life in the outback became a cult hit and put young Australian actor Mel Gibson on the fast track to superstardom? Here are your options. The options are Mad Max, Bird on a Wire, Lethal Weapon, The Bounty.
Mm. I'm apparently I'm really bad at movies. I don't know. Mad Max isn't aliens, but it's in a desert. But it's not aliens.
What's your
I don't know. I'm gonna go with The Bounty.
answer?
Mad Max is not aliens.
I didn't say aliens. I said post-apocalyptic life. It's Mad Max.
Mars. You said something about Mars. Oh, is it on Mars? The original? No, it's not.
Oh.
Because they talk about California or whatever.
I just gave it up.
I know, but I thought you
Are you
said
guys-
Mars. Did you not say Mars?
No. I didn't say Mars.
I heard Mars. I was like, when was he ever on Mars?
Second, I'm having problems with my headset. All of this is coming through my microphone. 1 second. All right. Gerald missed his chance to steal that point. You're going to have to cut that out because I got overlapping audio because it was all funky. Can somebody say something to make sure this is coming to my headset?
Hi.
Hello.
Okay, it's coming to my headset. Poor Gerald. Gerald,
Yes.
here you go. Hold. I'll be back. Arnold turned the line into his greatest catchphrase, and this movie spawned a robot army of stunt, spectacular sequels, a Universal Studios attraction, and a TV show. Which movie is this? The Terminator, iRobot, Commando, RoboCop.
Terminator.
Okay, Anais? Oh, she's going to get this. She has to get this.
I don't know. I'm hearing Mars apparently.
Movie. This is a newer movie. What are you trying to tell me? That I can dodge bullets? Well, thanks for the groundbreaking bullet time special effects created in this 1999 movie. When he was ready, Keanu Reeves didn't have to. What's the movie? V for Vendetta, Johnny Mnemonic, The Matrix, Equilibrium.
The Matrix.
Woohoo! Here we go. Anais, you've got a few questions. You can come back. You can do this. You can do this.
I'm almost better off not. Just...
Yeah.
As Captain Stephen Hiller in this movie, a top-grossing movie in 1996. Hey, it's not every day you get to save the world and punch tentacle aliens in the face. Which movie is this? Wild Wild West, I Am Legend, Independence Day, Bad Boys.
Wait, can you repeat it? You're like really low.
Wow, I'm having an issue with my headphones. Sorry. Will Smith stars as Captain Stephen Hiller in this movie, the top-grossing movie in 1996. Hey, it's not every day you get to save the world and punch tentacle aliens in the face. What movie is this? And the options are Wild Wild West, I Am Legend, Independence Day, and Bad Boys.
Independence Day.
Good job. Gerald?
Yes. You don't say good job to me when I get them right.
You're getting all of them.
Okay.
Except for this movie features a DeLorean that looks like a spaceship but is actually a time machine, a jacket that looks like a life vest, and Michael J. Fox using the musical stylings of Eddie Van Halen to torture his future father. What's that movie title? Back to the Future, Time Bandit, Teen Wolf, Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Back to the Future.
Good job. That was funny.
Good job.
There you go. There's your good job.
Thank you. I shall
You're
bask on
welcome.
that.
You needed your treat, right?
Yeah.
Harrison, trying to avoid being typecast all time as streetwise gun-slinging crook Han Solo, took the role of streetwise gun-slinging cop Rick Deckard. See, the haircut is totally different. Whose job is to hunt down a few rogue androids in the streets of Los Angeles in this film. Name that film. Force 10 from Navarone, Blade Runner, Witness, Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Wait, I didn't hear. What did he become? You sound really low.
I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do about it. My headset's messing up. Something's wrong.
Okay. So wait, hold on. It's Mel Gibson, and he's where?
No.
It's not Mel Gibson. No. Harrison Ford.
Harrison Ford.
It's not on Mars.
Avoid being typecast for all time as streetwise gunslinging crook Han Solo, took the role of streetwise gunslinging cop Rick Deckard, whose job is to hunt down a few rogue androids in the streets of Los Angeles. Name that film. Force 10 from Navarone, Blade Runner, Witness, Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Blade Runner?
Woohoo!
Force 10 from Navarone.
I was like, is that even real?
It is, but it's a sort of war film, so.
We're down to 2 questions. Ooh. You know what, Annie? If you get both these right, you can take it.
Okay.
I want to recount. Go on.
Let's do this. Gerald.
Yes.
An ocean liner is found in the Gobi Desert. Richard Dreyfuss gets a sunburn on half his face, and spaceships shaped like ice cream cones fail to pay the Ohio highway toll. Throw in Devil's Tower and a government cover-up, and you get what movie? And here are your options. Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Jaws, E.T., The X-Files.
This is tricky. So the options are...
Richard Dreyfuss with a sunburn.
Yeah.
Spaceships shaped like ice cream cones that don't pay their toll on the Ohio highway. And a Devil's Tower and a government cover-up. Which movie?
And what were the options?
Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Jaws, E.T., The X-Files.
I don't think it's any of them, but I'll go for Close Encounters.
Bam! You got it!
Oh, thank you.
Okay, now just because the question needs to be answered, and I kind of want to see if Anais knows this, because I want to make her feel good about herself.
Or bad.
One of the most technically innovative movies in filmmaking history, and certainly one of the most popular. This movie took place in a galaxy far, far away, and forever changed the way movies were made and watched. Name this movie. Star Wars, Howard the Duck, Star Trek the Motion Picture, Battlefield Earth.
Star Wars.
Hey.
Yay! So, Gerald,
Good job. So next week we are going to be reading, I've forgotten what it is. It's called The School by Donald Bartlemy.
But before you read that, head over to literaryroadhouse.com and let us know how you feel about Bloodchild. What did you think of the birthing scene? How about the implantation scene? Are you nauseous? Join our discussion in the comment section at literaryroadhouse.com, and while you're at,
Cut.
Cut. I don't even have to start from the beginning. Now that I do the editing, I know what to do. I can just go and scene.
Oh, very good.
Please join our discussion in the comments section at literaryroadhouse.com. While you're there, leave an iTunes, Stitcher, or Spreaker review. And if you enjoy our show, then maybe your friends would too. So be sure to share the podcast with everyone you know. Until next time, read a good story.